Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Not So Common podcast. I'm Pat Contry, and my guest this week is a big-time video game collector, even bigger than me. He's also a YouTuber. He is the Immortal John Hancock. John, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me on.
John, we don't speak as often as we should. You're someone that I actually respect a lot in the collecting scene. I looked up to for a couple of different reasons, which we'll get into. But give me some background, just for the rest of the audience, about when you started collecting.
Oh, geez. That goes back way before video games. I started as a kid going to flea marts with my mom. I give a lot of my collecting credit to my mom. My mom was a collector, collected Norman Rockwell plates, and she also collected Coca-Cola products. But we would go to the flea mart. We didn't have a lot of money. And I started collecting baseball cards. And I got pretty good at it. I would buy from other people there. And I was a little kid. And then I'd have my own table at a flea mart. And I would sell them for a profit just to get more baseball cards. And, you know, like many people, moved on from cards in the 80s to comic books. Late 80s. Cards to comics to action figures, but really what it came down to was that I really got fascinated with video games, and it was video games were being thrown out essentially everywhere. You could find them pretty cheap in the early 90s, and it really just kind of caught my attention because you could play what you were collecting. I really was fascinated by that. I was kind of tired of action figures just being in a package, and I don't know, it just was kind of boring, and so I just kind of really fascinated by collecting what I could play, and it just stuck. And so really since the early 90s, probably early to mid 90s was when I really started seriously collecting Nintendo, Atari, Genesis, etc.
So you were collecting this stuff while it was still, brand new. So you're talking about Genesis games, going after them when they were still in retail stores, when the system was still alive.
Yes. So, like, for example, I was targeting $5 Sega CD games at Toys R Us.
Ones they couldn't give away.
Yeah, I mean, so for a good example, Dark Wizard. Dark Wizard, an awesome Sega CD game, kind of often gets overlooked. And Toys R Us was selling it in my area at $5, new. And I was excited, just that, I learned that if you wait, instead of buying a lot of games new, you could get some good deals on clearance. And really, I didn't know how many other people were doing this. I didn't know who else was doing it. I didn't really care. I just was kind of having fun doing it. And I, for the collecting scene, I was looking around and I saw a lot of older collectors really caring about Atari as I got connected to forums and stuff. And they didn't give a crap about Sega Genesis or Odyssey 2 or any of that stuff.
Oh, they didn't like the Odyssey 2. They just wanted their 2600 games.
Yeah, good old early Classic Gaming Expo days. And it was a lot of fun. And I didn't get caught up in the value or anything. I enjoyed doing it. I had a budget. I did some silly things to save money. And I was just a poor college kid that was just enjoying playing video games and being a nerd.
So that's when you really started collecting. You were in college.
Yeah, I would say, when I started, I started working essentially when I was 16, but really by 18, when I was a freshman in college, I had a job, I had cheap rent, I had a car, and those are all great things to have if you're collecting. And so I would drive on the days off when I wasn't working to flea marts and just kind of game hunt.
Is that
this is kind of...
I'm sorry, I keep hearing you say flea marts. Is that a colloquialism to the Northwest? I don't really hear that expression too often.
Yeah, flea marts. We had two flea marts. We had an outdoor market in which you could score some great games for cheap, and it was called Epperson's. It was nicknamed the Dirt Farm. It was dusty and dirty, and there was typically one or two game sellers there. And they all knew me by name. They were pretty nice. They always cut me deals. And then the Jolly Giant Flea Mart, which is the one in Reading, it's still around. And there's still a game guy there who knows me by name when I go there. And I just went there for years and just would go on the weekends and score some games and I'd probably bring like 20 or 40 bucks on the weekends, and that was my big spending money.
It's interesting that you had a somewhat similar arc in terms of focusing on what to collect as I did. I was big into baseball cards, as many people were in the 80s. I mean, I played Little League, but also, was reading some comics, buying them into the 90s. And then, action figures, I was still kind of playing them, but also buying them as I got older towards high school. You really stop playing with action figures, usually, which is unfortunate because they're fun to play with. But then, video games, late high school, early college. That's an interesting progression. So when you were growing up, what were the game systems you played growing up as a child?
Game systems growing up, my first console, as I've stated on my channel, was a TV scoreboard by Radio Shack. So some people don't count the Pong as a true console, but yes,
it's a console. It counts.
Yeah. So that was the first one in my home. I played an Atari 2600 at my cousin's house. I had 3 cousins that lived nearby, and they would kick my butt. I was the youngest. They would kick my butt. I was actually second youngest, but they'd kick my butt at combat. They'd all want to play me at combat because I would lose. And they would just but it was a lot of fun. The kids would go into the cousin's room and we'd play 2600, just the classics, Berserk, Combat. Those are the 2 that I remember. Space Invaders, a little bit of Asteroids. But Combat was big because we both could play at the same time. And so that was huge. Later, I do believe my parents rented first for $20 on a weekend a Nintendo Entertainment System in '87 with a few games, Castlevania being the first Nintendo game I played. And I was scared playing it at night. I remember that. And just good times. But yeah, eventually my parents, I think, bought a Nintendo. I don't recall exactly who that was. It was probably my mom. My dad didn't really like video games, but he tolerated them because if we got good grades, it didn't really matter. And we were good kids. I wasn't a troublemaker or anything. And so I remember playing that in '87, a Nintendo, but my first console that I earned myself was a Sega Genesis. And I bought that near launch because I know back then there wasn't really a launch date, but I remember getting an Altered Beast Sega Genesis combo for about $200.
So that was back in '89. You managed to snag
back
one.
in '89.
Very
yes.
nice. Again, it's a little bit similar to me. When I was growing up, we had a Coleco Telstar Ranger.
Nice.
It was interesting because I always forgot what it was, so I just started searching standalone Pong clone consoles, and I said, "Oh, that's the one." When I saw it, it had the big Magnum gun that could get you killed if you walked outside with it.
Yeah.
They were some of those had some nice little pistols that came with it. And then my cousins. I also had 3 cousins. There were 3 brothers who had an Atari 2600, but they usually didn't let me play it. They claimed that I broke one of the joysticks, and I was very young, so I probably wasn't that good at the games back then anyway. But yeah, and also in '87, I was surprised to hear that you had a rental. In '87, interested to see if there was a rental case, if you remember. But in '87, Christmas is when I got my NES.
I think what I remember best is that it was a black case, and it looked like it was. And this is going off, a memory a long time ago. So I do remember that there was a cutout foam. You'd open it up, and there was instructions like "Don't lose anything," and then it'd be like a $50 fee if anything was lost or damaged. And I remember it being just like a generic rental case, black with foam inside, with all the controllers and stuff. And then the typical NES rental clear cases, with the photocopied manual.
Okay.
Yep.
So they probably got some sort of, I guess, a generic, like a Travel Master or something, whatever at the time, and just cut it to fit. That's interesting.
Yeah, because that's what I remember.
Because there is a couple of hard NES cases. There's that red one, which is somewhat hard to find. And by the way, for people listening, John's having construction done in his house. If you hear any hammering in the background, he's having another.
I apologize.
An addition to the game room being built on, probably. But what I think was interesting about the early days of the NES is that it didn't seem like, unlike big game system launches now, back when it came out, it's not like everyone got it at the same time. It sort of slowly creeped into children's existence. When I first started playing it, I remember, I think, seeing it sometime in '86. I remember going to like a PC Richards or regional electronics store in the Northeast, and I remember seeing it set up to play. But then it sort of like slips from your mind, and then once you hit like '87, you start seeing more commercials.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden it's in all the circulars, the Sunday, ads. You're like, okay, I want this for Christmas. And I think that's what happened with a lot of kids I know, is that like '87, and then you get to '88 was like the first year or two that a lot of the kids I knew had it. Before that, '86, not really. '85, no one had it that I knew.
Correct. That's my experience. '87, it was really, you could rent them, and then by '88, a lot of people started having them. And I was in kind of a conservative area, so a lot of families really liked Nintendo games because of they were just kind of wholesome, at least on the surface, and it just kind of there was a lot of like church families in the area, and they all had Nintendo games. Ironically, the same families had pirated Commodore 64 games as well, which I thought was funny.
Pick and choose your morals, right?
That's right.
Did you grow up with computers as well, computer games, or?
Yes, I did. I didn't have my first computer in my home that I remember was the Atari ST 520. Ironically, I just picked up a Atari ST 1040, but a lot of my friends had Commodore 64. That's really what I grew up with. And as time moved on, I had some friends with an Atari ST and Amiga. But I don't remember. I kind of grew up before IBM PC took off. But in high school, I had a Packard Bell 486, and that was a terrible computer. But I played a lot of my great classic computer games on it.
The age of Packard Bell and Gateway 2000, right?
Oh yeah,
making
piece of crap computer.
But they're affordable. But
that's right. That's right. My mom could afford it, and
compact Rosario. Yeah.
Oh yeah. We had that terrible computer for a long time. I played a lot of games on it, and it served its purpose, but it was a pretty terrible computer.
So I have to ask you. I don't think I ever asked you your nickname, the Immortal. Was that given to you? Was that self-chosen? How did that come about?
Oh, that was given to me. Long story short, Drunken Master Paul, who appears on Metal Jesus Rocks channel, he and Jason, so he visited my game room for the first time, and he essentially gave me that nickname. And so that's what he always called me after that. And so when I decided, I didn't really know what I was doing with YouTube for a while. And then when I decided, okay, I'm going to start making videos because I don't like talking to myself, and I might as well talk to other people, and decided to use that nickname for my channel. And that's what always, whenever I appeared on Metal Jesus Rocks channel, that's what he called me. So that's how it was given to me.
So in terms of your YouTube career, how did you first decide, okay, I'm going to take the plunge and talk about old dusty video games that no one really cares about? Like, how did that happen?
Well, it evolved from my terrible DVDs that I used to do. I had this idea where I was going to archive. I really wanted to kind of showcase working consoles. I was worried that, and this is so funny looking back at it, like I wanted to showcase my collection and inventory what I have and show classic consoles working. And I knew that there was other people that had stuff, but not many people were recording it. So I was just taking a standard camcorder and recording things working, hoping, even though the video quality was terrible, it still would educate people on what was out there and what you needed to know about classic consoles. And so I did this for scratch money at expos, thinking someone might care, someone out there might care. And I was so nervous. So I first started selling these at a mid-2000s classic gaming expo when I did a road trip with other people from the Portland Retro Gaming Expo board. And my first sale, I'll never forget this. I was so nervous. My first sale was someone I really looked up to, Leonard Herman. So he came up and he saw these interesting DVDs. I was so nervous because I had no idea if I was going to sell any. I ended up selling out and did this for years. Just made these simple how-to videos of how to collect stuff.
I was going to say, I remember you gave me, you graciously gave me a couple of your collecting guide DVDs about 5 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it wasn't the best. I mean, I'm not a real high tech person, and so I kind of dabbled with it, but I always wanted it to be better. And to this day, I'm kind of a low tech person, but I thought, okay, people are doing this YouTube thing. I have this crazy collection. It would be stupid for me not to do videos because there's stuff in my collection that's pretty odd, and I enjoy doing it. It's something that it's a side job. And I used to be teaching at college and had to give that up because of my current job as an elementary school teacher is pretty taxing. And essentially the YouTube thing has taken the place of my secondary job. And so it's a lot of fun. I'm enjoying doing it, doing 3 videos a week and talking about strange oddball stuff and just kind of going all over the place, going classic computer stuff to clone hardware to an occasional Earthbound prototype that gets found locally.
Sure. I was going to get to that later. So you were attracted to really the educational aspect of sharing the knowledge of your collection with people who may be searching randomly on YouTube, want to learn about, like you said, like oddball items or something that might be unique or rare.
Yeah, I'm really drawn to the oddball stuff. I kind of consider myself an oddball collector, and I'm really drawn to one thing that kind of I try not to do a lot. It's hard not to do some of it because it gets views, is the mainstream stuff like Nintendo Switch and SNES Classic Mini, stuff like that. But I really want to delve into the oddball stuff. I have some crazy odd stuff planned for the summer that I want to do on my channel. And really that's the stuff I get excited about because not many other people have it, and even less people want to record and talk about it.
Sure. That's pretty much how I evolved in terms of, it's like I have technically only one or 2 complete sets, and I have a third that's almost complete, the NES. But I'm not like you have so many completed. What did you told me before we started recording? 26 complete. 26 complete North American sets, which is wow. That's a journey that I probably cannot begin to undertake to get close to that, even if I wanted to. But and plus the room to store all that's another issue, storage space.
Oh, it's crazy.
But
that's crazy.
There's items that I look out for that are very unique that not even a lot of hardcore collectors know about, that I try to keep up on, that I look out for, and that's really what drives me in order to find this stuff and then also to tell people about it. There's one item in particular I have to get repaired. That's a very unique NES item. Once it's repaired, I probably will do a video on it, and it would be like probably the first of its kind on YouTube.
Awesome.
So there's stuff like that, and you're probably the same way. You're like, okay, I want to find this stuff out, which really brings up the issue of, like, when does a collector become a preservationist, and is there a unique distinction there, or is there a lot of overlap there? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, did you start off a collector with a little bit of preservation side, and then you find yourself maybe becoming more and more of a preservation guy?
That's a great question, Pat. I honestly think that when I started collecting, I didn't know who else was doing this or if anybody else cared. And I think for me, initially, it was, okay, this is a hobby that I can get into on a poor college student budget. This is neat. I wasn't thinking about value or anything. It was just fun. It was, I killed time. I went to an outdoor market, and I was able to spend some money and buy some games, and I really got interested in the educational aspect. I think as time evolved, I was shown a lot of oddball systems. I'll never forget, there was a video game journalist at the time. He's kind of, I think, left the scene, but it was Zach Meston back in the day. He did a lot of working designs. He worked at Working Designs and some strategy guides, and he was known as a game journalist. He really actually kind of brought me into the circle of oddball stuff. He showed me the Bally Astrocade. He showed me a lot of the oddball consoles that I got really kind of fascinated with. And once I read the book, Phoenix Rise and Fall Video Games, which I'm sure you know about this awesome book. It's in its 4th edition now. And I just got fascinated with the history. And that was probably in 2000. Probably by 2000, I was really kind of fascinated with the educational aspect of it. And the sky was the limit. Like, I just wanted to know about oddball stuff. And I was just curious what else is out there, how weird can it get, and it got pretty weird. It got pretty weird. I met some other oddball collectors and I had a lot of fun. And I think one thing that kind of drove me to collect the oddball stuff is that on the fringe of collecting, it becomes more hobbyist, and it's less about the value. It's less about kind of like how rare and expensive something is. It's just about, oh my gosh, there's someone else out there that gives a crap about a console.
Oh, absolutely.
And I kind of enjoy that aspect of it. And that's kind of where I kind of call home, is that when I can delve into an oddity and someone else is just excited about someone remembering a console. The Bally Astrocade is probably my favorite oddball console. And there's a great users group, and that they talk about it every now and then. And now there's even reproduction carts being made with boxes on the 2600 connection, which I'm pretty excited about.
Not familiar with that. The 2600 connection, or we're talking.
Yeah. So Atari. It's a website that sells homebrews and oddities, mostly for 2600 and Magnavox Odyssey 2. The cool thing about the site is that they're cheap. I mean, you can get a homebrew for like $25 plus shipping.
Okay. And
that to me is like at a hobbyist level, where it's not crazy expensive, and it's just fun. It's that to me is like you get a cool collectible, but it's not like gonna break the bank. It's one thing I get kind of it's tiring kind of sometimes. You see these awesome projects, and then you see that they're expensive, so it limits how many I can personally get.
Yeah, I tend not to follow the homebrew stuff as much, just because there's so much out there, and it's really hard to keep track. I know there's some people that like want to get every NES homebrew, and it's not for me. There's a couple that I have. I was just sent from the creator of the Super Russian Roulette cartridge. Since we covered it on the podcast, he was gracious enough to send Ian and I both a copy of that, and that's a cool, unique one. So that's one I was definitely on the lookout for. But let's get back to, I guess, the mind of a collector in terms of oddball. Isn't there a little bit of oddball to, I'd say, the purist collector? Because why else would someone want to, get, whether it's, like you said, like Norman Rockwell plates, or NES games or 2600 games? There's, I guess, a certain thought process that we have versus the average person, where it's like, okay, we want to go out and look for this stuff. We want to try to appreciate it, where 99% of people will be like, yeah, it's cool, but who really cares? It's not worth my time.
It does take an odd person to pursue, I think, any collection. And it takes dedication, it takes commitment long term. For most people, especially back in the day, I know that you're in this boat where it was not all bought off eBay. It was a lot of game hunting, a lot of researching, a lot of contacting people, and it's kind of a journey. And for me, I never would have imagined having even one complete set when I started this. I didn't even know what all was out there. Of course, me, like several other NES collectors out there, Mike Kettler's NES Rarity Guide.
Absolutely.
Was what I used for my initial list.
I think we all did.
Yeah. And so, with other people, I remember, this is so funny. I remember I was so excited. My first complete US collection was Magnavox Odyssey 2. And I remember going up to Joe Santulli at one of the early Classic Gaming Expos, so excited that I found at his show like the final game. I think it was volleyball or something stupid in box, and I was so excited. He was gracious enough. He just saw me as kind of like probably just a little kid that was excited about completing something. So, but definitely agree that collectors in general, you have to be a little odd to pursue stuff, especially now where some of these the values of these things has gotten crazy.
Oh, sure. We'll get into that, whether we see a peak or not in terms of some of the market value on this stuff. And we say that the day of recording, or a sealed statement event just closed at $42,000 on eBay.
It's crazy.
We'll see if it gets paid for. It's a whole other discussion. But speaking of that, I actually stumbled randomly across a Mike Ettler auction since he sells on eBay. I saw it. I said, oh, that's Mike Ettler. That's his name. I was like, oh, that's the guy. That's the guy that really helped jumpstart NES collecting in the 90s. Besides the whole,
absolutely.
Besides finding, thank God he found all those Cheetah Men 2 carts. You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, Mike Etler is definitely a legend. Love to meet the guy someday. I think it's always interesting though when you talk about the collector from, let's say, the 90s versus today. There is a certain mindset I think that's definitely different, and
Absolutely.
I really think not that you can't be a true, quote unquote, true collector and not discuss price, but I think it's the sort of the order of interest is what's really important to me. Like when I have someone come up to me and just talk about the value of their games first and foremost, or want to ask me, how much is this game worth? I found it, and it's just like, yeah, that's cool to know the value of that, or really to delve into, what are these games that hold their value. But to me, that's not the most interesting part of the story when it comes to collecting. That's a small piece of that entire pie. Whether it's learning about the system, or learning about the specific publisher, the era the game came out, or actually, God forbid, the game itself and how the game is.
So true. You're so correct with that. You hit it. You just bring up such a valid point. It just drives me nuts. It drives me nuts when someone comes up to you, and I just being in the, with a psychology background and previous jobs, I can tell pretty quickly where someone's going with something.
Mm-hmm.
If they have an edge, if it's all about just the value of it. And it drives me nuts when someone comes up and that's all they really care about is what to invest in and is this a good deal. And if I can tell that they don't care about anything else, I'll just not even answer them.
Oh, really? You'll just say like, yeah.
I've done that. Yeah, just like, well, you may want to just use completed eBay auctions to find your value.
Sure.
Or use Google.
Yeah, that's what I do sometimes when I see emails where it's like, hey, Pat, I found this. What's it worth? And it's like, you can search for that yourself. What am I going to tell you? That's any different than what's online. So how do you see that? I mean, you've been around before. I guess the difference is in the 90s, no one really cared about the value of these games because they had no value. And then once you hit around the mid-2000s, 2006 is always my sort of starting point where games really start to increase in price a little bit. And then again in 2011 and probably again 2014 or so. You had like 3 jumps. How do you feel about that? You feel just a natural progression of once more people get interested in these games, of course, it's going to bring more people into it. You're going to have people that want to capitalize on the value and quote unquote invest. Is it just sort of it is what it is? It happened with baseball cards. It happened with comic books. It almost destroyed the comic book industry in the 90s. It basically destroyed the sports card industry. I don't think it ever recovered from that fully. From like the 90s. So like, what do you tell someone who's looking to get into collecting for quote unquote the right reasons about how investing has sort of affected the scene?
Well, I think that the big issue is there's so many collectors out there, and I see their collection, and it's all like the high end stuff, and they really worried about the market crashing. And it's just that type of collector honestly makes me sick. And I hate saying that, but I'm being honest. It does that type of person that gets into the market will also be the reason if there is a correction, which I do believe there will be. I don't know if there'll be a crash, but there'll be a correction when values of things start to stabilize or go to a certain level. I don't know. That's when I think there's a lot of people right now that are selling or wanting to sell or curious about this being an investment versus people that actually care about what's actually on the physical cart of a game.
That's not to say there can't be some overlap. Again,
there is some major overlap, and there's some great collectors out there. It's just I think the market's pretty imbalanced right now, and I think that I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't think there'll be a crash, but I definitely see a correction coming.
I think it's going to be. I wanted to ask you this because I wasn't around for this because I started collecting more the late 90s NES. But I always hear the parallels of the huge correction that happened with Atari collectors and Atari games. Because in the 90s were basically where NES collectors are now. Guys basically hitting their late 20s to maybe early 40s, that like 12-year period where they wanted to go back and buy these old games. So, of course, in the 90s then, that's really the first wave, I'd say, of video game collectors going back and getting those 2600 games from like 12, 14, 15 years before, right? So when you saw it back then, was it kind of similar to how NES collecting is now? Do you see any parallels to that? What was it like?
I do. So my experience was nobody gave a crap about anything about Nintendo is still pretty popular back then, but nothing like it is now. I mean, I was the little kid when I moved up to Washington in 2005. I was a baby, but minus 10. So going back to 1995, nobody cared about Sega Genesis. Nobody did. It was Nintendo, some Nintendo, but mostly the big collectors were Atari. And those were the people that had the money. Those are the people that had the disposable income. That's what they grew up with. So all that stuff was being collected for. But I see there's tons of parallels. I think Nintendo's like not high-end Nintendo. I think that Holy Grail stuff will always keep its value, but like the mid to lower range stuff I see is dropping. And because part of that is because it's gotten so expensive, less people are pursuing it.
Well, isn't it also that everyone who wants the carts have them? Are we getting to that same point where one of the arguments, I don't know if you saw from Renee from Storage Wars go after me because I was criticizing his price evaluation of that storage unit, but when he says, those 300 Atari games are worth $3,000, those are $10 each. Not an average $10 each. When I was trying to point out, anyone who wants a Centipede Atari 2600 game has had it for 15 years at least. Anyone who has a Combat has had it for 20 years. There's not many new people looking for those 2600 games.
I agree, and I think there's some other factors too. I think the rise in multi-carts and people being satisfied with like a Raspberry Pi just to play stuff. The value difference now is affecting, I think, how many people are going to get into the scene. You also have the rise of pirated consoles that you can get from not so honest websites that sell all sorts of crazy stuff that's a reproduction. And for a lot of people, a reproduction's fine. And so I think there's a lot of things that are going to affect value in the long run, on top of an entire generation growing up that's not going to even know what a physical media anything is.
Do you see that? I'm sorry to cut you off, but I was going to get to that. But did you see that happening now in terms of like the Atari 2600 collectors were never replaced? You had the first generation that had them. Once they were gone, value plummets. Maybe, I don't know, in the 90s or early 2000s, if a Centipede cart was like a $7 game and now it's $1. I don't know if that's how it was, but do you see that happening now with Nintendo where, you have some younger kids getting into it and replacing some of us in their 30s and 40s, but do you see it really taking a nosedive after that where there's not going to be any more new collectors get into it?
I think there's several factors. I think this is, again, a great point. I think that there'll be always some people out there that want to jump in, but I think there'll be more people that have stuff that will be trying to sell. And the bigger that imbalance gets, that's when you're going to see value go down. Because there's a lot of people waiting on the sideline right now, waiting for the right time to sell. When they start seeing a nosedive in prices, that's when you're going to see, I think, a lot of people try to unload. Because they're waiting. They're waiting for the right time to sell when the market peaks. And who knows when that time is. I think there's a lot of factors. But I agree with you saying, I think there's less people replacing the people that already have it. And I see that with Nintendo. I think people are moving on to PlayStation, PS2. That's kind of the next generation of people collecting. We haven't seen the top of that market hit. And we're just now starting to see prices rise. And I think it's going to continue. And I think the PlayStation collecting market may be just as big as Nintendo. And for multiple factors, with one of them being that discs get scratched and there'll be less complete working copies of things on the market.
So you see that maybe for the PlayStation collectors, maybe that'd be a little bit more about the game playing experience versus a classic NES collector?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, with any collectors, I think it matters that the game works, whether they play it or not. If a game doesn't work, I think even collectors that don't play their games, they want a working copy of it.
Sure.
And so I think that's gonna matter with PlayStation as well, and it's gonna be harder because there's less working copies that are not all jacked up. The nice thing about collecting carts, which is what I'm always loved about it, is that I could drop kick a cart. I never would, but I could drop kick a cart and it still would work, and it would work. I could slide an Atari 2600 cart across the ground. I could step on it. it still will work.
Bury in a landfill, and it'll still work, which is true. You bring up a couple of good points. First, I would think that just because Nintendo is, sort of the leader of the pack in terms of being recognizable for video games and its mascots, I think that will always be the primary collecting market. I think there will be a PlayStation. You bring up a good point, John, about the nature of playing PlayStation versus a cartridge-based system. It's a hell of a lot harder to emulate disc-based consoles versus cartridge-based, isn't it? So, like, I could download the entire NES library in one file in roughly 8 seconds, and I could download that file, maybe less than that. Can't do that for the PlayStation library. Can't do that for the PS2 library. Can't do that for the Xbox library. It's a little more cumbersome to download all those ISOs for all those games. So that's a great point. It might be a quote-unquote more pure collector base for the disc-based systems. It just might be. And plus, who really wants all those PS2 games? Is gonna be that many completionist collectors for a PS2 library besides yourself, John? But for most,
I'm not there yet. But I agree that it's. I think it's gonna be. I think with PlayStation especially, it's gonna be subset collecting. There's gonna be a lot of people going after the RPGs. Mm-hmm. There's gonna be people pursuing the long box. And there might be a couple weirdos out there that actually care about the greatest hits collections. So
the variants, right?
Yeah, the variants, the black label. I mean, it's too big, I think, to collect in its entirety. But there's a lot of great subsets.
Oh, sure,
and great games out there. But I think that generationally, the thing moving forward is that the Nintendo is not the center of the universe anymore with video games. Back in the late '80s. Early 90s, Nintendo, correct me if I'm wrong, 90% of the market. They dominated the video game market. They just were cleaning house. They knocked it out of the park with the Nintendo. Out came the Game Boy and then the Super Nintendo. And they couldn't do anything wrong. And at least until the N64. But even though I love the N64, that's really where I think they lost some people.
Mistakes were made. Mistakes were definitely made. If they played their cards right, there would never have been a PlayStation, and then Sony wouldn't be the juggernaut they are. Well, at least they're not an overall juggernaut in terms of where they were 20 years ago, but at least in the video game world, they wouldn't be the juggernaut they are now.
And I think that, and I agree with that, Pat. And I think that as time goes on, the success or failure of the Switch long term and Nintendo's relevance in the market is going to affect its collectability.
Sure. I think, though, that what we're seeing with Nintendo having theme parks, the Switch is so far doing as best as it possibly could be doing.
Yes.
I think they're in great shape. They have the most recognizable and marketable Disney type of first-party characters out there.
They are the McDonald's of video games, definitely.
Yes, I think that's the prime difference. When people look back, like you said, when people go back and try to collect PlayStation 1 games, like you said, I think they'll be mostly, like you said, subset collectors. People that want all the working designs games or all the weird RPGs or the one-off, I don't know, some of the light gun games that are on the PlayStation that were interesting. Me personally, it's funny you said that because I guess without knowing it, I started picking up whenever I saw them. I just started picking up the first 6 months or so when I did the long box, those crappy paper cardboard ones, and they went to the harder cases for a bit. I have a chunk of those. I probably have more than 60-70% of those releases just picking up when I see them at the flea markets the past 8-9 years. And I think that's what you're going to get. You're going to be hard pressed to find that set of people that are going to go out, I think, and buy all the PlayStation 1 games.
Yeah, and I think they're going to be harder to find too, because one cool thing about Nintendo, and I think what makes Nintendo really kind of the nice happy medium to collect something is that it's cartridge based. They're pretty durable. They're fun game. The ROMs on the actual cartridges have enough substance there. It's sprite based games I think age better than polygon based games.
Sure.
So I popped in a Saturn game yesterday and it just looked fugly. It was just terrible looking, and I'm just people don't say that about Nintendo stuff. Mm-hmm. And that brings back to why newer generations don't play Atari stuff, because there's kind of a a line in the sand where it's like, okay, it can look simple, but it can't look that simple to where people start complaining about the graphics.
It can't. It is, there's. I always say to people, the reason why the NES is sort of the go-to, one of the reasons why the go-to sort of, we remember this as the retro game console, is that that's really the first console where it's like, okay, we now have recognizable and marketable, video game characters. When I see Super Mario Brothers, running across the screen, that's a huge step above Pitfall Harry on the 2600. That's like,
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's like an entire generational jump ahead. That I think that, okay, now when kids see that, like kids that are 4-year-olds nowadays versus 30 years ago, they're going to have the same experience versus, I think, give a 4-year-old Pitfall Harry nowadays to look at, and they'll be like, ooh, okay. I just see a stick figure. It's not as interesting to me. I can draw up my crayons, something that looks better than an Atari 2600 game. I think that's the difference, I think, to me, when I look at that.
Yeah, and it's nowhere marketed. I mean, it's just Atari never did a great job marketing their characters. I mean, they were really, even with the 2600, they didn't know how to market it until Space Invaders came. And then it kind of hit its sweet spot with the arcades, Ryzen arcades, but nobody has topped Nintendo with video game characters. I'd even say Sony and Microsoft struggle at really marketing and defining their video game characters compared to Nintendo. That's really why Nintendo is still around, is because they have great video game characters and they do a phenomenal job marketing that.
Well, I think that's what Atari's, one of their, I guess they didn't see it at the time. They never said, hey, let's invest in our own IPs. Because when people look back at it, 2600 or Atari, they erroneously reference stuff like even Pitfall, which was Activision, or Pac-Man, which was not Atari. It's Namco. Or Qbert, which is Gottlieb. Yeah. Poor old Gottlieb, quickly forgotten. So Atari has Warlords, they have Centipede, they have Asteroids. And then you're already running out of steam, right? There's not a huge amount more, and those don't have like cute, recognizable characters. You have the Centipede little spaceship or gnome, whatever box art you're looking at, right? Asteroids, what the hell is that? A triangle? Like that's they never thought of, okay, let's come up with our own Pac-Man. Let's go for this. It was almost like at the time they were just happy to make the games just to make them, and didn't realize that, okay, we need maybe we don't have the technology to make like our own Super Mario Brothers. We can't do that on a console.
They just didn't understand the home market. I think they really were innovative making classic arcade games, and they really kind of benefited from owning all the rights and porting a lot of those classic arcade games to home.
Missile Command
was really, and Defender and a lot of those. And what's really funny is that when really the home market took off is when Nintendo was able to really kind of show gamers and people, hey, you know what? We don't have to rely on the arcades to make a great gaming experience. In fact, we're going to offer something totally unique that's going to expand upon, a gaming experience, but we're going to make it totally unique. And then make it child friendly, and it's like knock it out of the park.
Well, that's amazing to me, right? You can make the argument and ColecoVision was sort of lost a little bit because the crash happened not too far after that was released in '82, right? But
and a terrible controller, yes.
Not as bad as in television, but all right. But for the NES though, you had the arcade machines literally being, for the first time, home console. The arcade machine was the same in the VS, the same as the home console.
Yes.
Like that was it. They got to that point. Okay, now we're here. On the 2600. No, the arcade version was not on there. The most infamous being, Pac-Man was not even close. Miss Pac-Man, you got closer. Even the 5200 wasn't the arcade experience. You got closer, wasn't the arcade. 7800 was like, yeah, we got there for 5 years too late, right? It was done by then. But for Nintendo, they can go and have their Play Choice 10 machines and be like, oh, we can advertise our home console games in the arcade. We can do a reversal. Yep. We can get people interested in the home console and just put those games in the arcade at the same time to show them up. Like, it was a different time. I want to get back to, though, in terms of the parallels in NES and Atari 2600 collecting, because I want to speak to my experiences that I'd say the past year and a half, 2 years, going to video game conventions, which I go to about 8 a year, it seems like. Last year I probably did about 12 since I was helping promote a certain NES guidebook, so I beat myself to death. But what I see, maybe you can comment on it after I make my point, is that we are getting to that state now where I think a lot of these rare games, the top quote-unquote grail games, whether it's Little Samson, Bonk's Adventure NES, they're being held, a huge chunk of them, I think, by these game sellers are in control of them, right?
Right.
At the same time, you have the collectors out there, like we mentioned before. If you're into NES collecting, you've been into it for a while, you have all the common games. You have all the very common games.
Correct.
So when I go to these collections, I will see boxes and boxes and boxes of the dirt common NES games now sitting there. And they're not being bought. They are just sitting there. And you will hear about the deals being made for, someone will pick up a Little Samson maybe. So maybe someone will pick up a Panesian game like Bubble Bath Babes. Or maybe like a Nintendo World Championship will trade hands in person. But I'd say we're getting to that dangerous point where there are more games sitting in sellers' hands than people are interested in buying those games.
I 100% agree, and that's kind of what I was talking about, is that because the value has gotten so crazy, and I think that's even the mindset of a lot of collectors out there that, if things are going to cost a lot of money, I'm gonna go for top tier stuff, or I'm gonna go for a subset. And that middle ground games, especially because it's so expensive, I think, to go for a set now, those aren't selling great. If it's kind of like a game that's just okay, on top of being not a highly sought after game, I'm seeing a lot of that stuff sit. And I think the middle part of the market is just evaporating. So you have the cheap stuff that sells, I think, especially the good stuff that's fun to play. That will always typically, I think, sell if the price is right, just because it's cheap. And then you'll have the high-end stuff that people always want because they can put that in their game collection and be a mantelpiece. But that middle ground, nope.
You're talking like the $20 to $60 game, yep. Something like that?
Yeah, I see that's a much harder sell now because it's just kind of and it's a lot of money to blow on a game that's just okay.
You know, it was one game that I specifically, in my head, I went to Too Many Games, which is probably the biggest retro gaming convention on the East Coast, or gaming in general. Obviously, the West Coast, Northwest, and there's Portland's the motherlode. You have the Seattle one, for example, classic game. Expo comes up in Vegas still every couple of years. But the one game that I was shocked I saw 5 copies of, and I counted, only one sold that whole weekend on the NES, was Blackjack.
Huh, really? Yep, that's a good example.
Blackjack is a rare game. I would argue that Blackjack is a lot harder to find than Little Samson is.
Agree.
In the book, I almost made Little Samson very uncommon instead of rare. I was teetering. I was like, this might be just very uncommon. It's just people think it's rare because it's worth a lot, because people like the game. It's an excellent game. But Blackjack, 5 copies, and I heard one sold that weekend because it was like a good deal on that one. If this was about 3-4 years ago, I'd argue that all 5 of those copies would have been gone.
I totally agree. That was a hard one for me to find.
Yeah, that's not, because that's a game that really speaks to, okay, are you collecting here, or you really want to play this game? Because no one wants to buy Blackjack to play it.
Correct.
It's a very simple game. It's not a bad game, but it does what it says on the cover. It's Blackjack. But there's no way in hell you're going to buy that game unless you're looking to complete a set. There's no one out there looking to get a subset of crappy, or semi-mediocre games that are rare. So when I saw that really, a light bulb went off, and I said, okay, I think we've peaked now. I think there's less collectors going for full sets or a lot of the rare games versus the ones that are in sellers' hands.
Agree.
And that, I'm saying, that's just, obviously that's anecdotal, but, that weekend I saw, one guy had a couple stadium events, another seller had like 3 or 4 Little Samsons, and I think those are selling too at a much lower rate, because I think we're getting to that point where, okay, do I really want to pay $1,000 for a cart-only Little Samson? And I think we're hitting that point where now we're getting to the not that it's unreasonable. How do you define that? You're talking to someone that spent 5 figures on a game before. But for a game like Little Samson, where if you go to a show and you can find 10 copies, is that really $1,000 game then? at that point?
I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And with all the reproduction copies out there, and just it's at that point where it's just mind blowing what some of the stuff's worth. And I think, especially with regular Nintendo, I'm definitely seeing even a demand. Like, I can even just look at my YouTube videos, and there's less people watching my Nintendo-based YouTube content on regular NES. Yeah. One thing I've noticed is that standard Nintendo videos that I do get less views.
Versus base Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo?
Yeah, definitely. Super Nintendo is still pretty popular. But I don't know if it's because there's more content out there. I mean, there's a lot of factors there, but I definitely see Nintendo's at its peak. It's definitely at least on a collectability level. There's a slight downside there. And I think that part of the other thing too is I think there's more and more people that grew up with things after Nintendo now. So you have Super Nintendo, N64, PlayStation. Those people with disposable income, that's what they're going to pursue.
Or dinosaurs on YouTube. I mean, YouTube's for younger people. So
yes, it is.
We're talking about, a system that's been Super Nintendo's been dead for almost 20 years now. Only 20 years. And so, yeah, it makes sense that that's a time when it gets sort of the popularity peak or when it starts to rise more and more. And game prices on Super Nintendo have been going up for, 4 years now. A lot. And then Genesis followed a little bit. Everything went up, but, Super Nintendo probably went up, I'd argue, the most out of the other consoles post NES. Do you see there, we alluded to there not being a crash, but I have seen a couple of, at least a few big collectors sell off a chunk of their collection or get out of it. Do you think there'll be a panic, or just there'll be a quiet wave where the collectors will try to keep it quiet, that there isn't, a quote unquote, you call it correction in the market, where maybe that little Samson comes down to like $500 instead of $1,000, for example, or maybe, all the $20 to $60 games come back down to $15, or which I think is going to happen, all the $3 to $8 games go back down to $1 to $4. It'll turn more into like 2600 collecting, where you won't be able to give away a bases loaded 2 game for $1. Like, you won't be able to.
I see two realities, and it's hard to speculate, but I think the middle part of the market is going to have a correction. And part of that is that the collectors over time have changed as well. And so I think as time went on and things got popular, people started getting into games because it was popular. It was, people hold on to things that have value. When people see things lose value, that's when they start determine whether or not they should get out. Nintendo, especially that type of generation, I think that as time goes on, many of those people that grew up with Nintendo are starting to have kids or had kids, or at a point where space is limited. It takes up a lot of space. And as prices have gone up, it's also changed a lot of attitudes about the collector market. I've seen the collector market in itself kind of change, not necessarily for the better. There's a lot of people my age that have gotten out mostly because of just other collectors, or it's hard to find, or YouTube, or etc. I mean, it's a lot of different factors, but I see that the middle part of the market is going to change. And I don't know how extreme that is, but I know that I definitely see more Nintendo stuff at cheaper prices, which is great because I'm trying to go for a near complete Nintendo set, and I don't care about the value. I just I'd like to go after some of that uncommon stuff, and I've seen prices drop about 15% over the last year.
You're talking again the middle of the ground.
The middle of the ground.
Like the pot.
Yeah.
So not just the uncommon games or even a rare game that isn't sought after, like Blackjack, for example.
Conan the
Barbarian. We're talking even like Conan. It's not a great game.
Not a great
but it's
game,
interesting.
and uncommon.
It's hard to find.
Yep.
Do you see that even with the popular common games, something like a Contra that peaked at like say $40, and maybe that comes down a little bit because everyone has it and they're not going to pay that much for Contra, or is that going to still maintain its value?
I think it's going to still retain its value because if you buy a NES, buy a NES clone console, you still want to play those classics, and unless those classics flood the market, there's less available. A good friend of mine, I know you know him too, Corey. Corey's a local vendor, has a store, Classics and Oddities. And his challenge is that he doesn't have those common titles walk in the store still. So
Sure.
he can put really any price on them when they do come in, and people will buy them. And so that's where he's at. And I would say that's fairly common across brick and mortar stores. Now on eBay it might be a little bit different, but there isn't more of those being made. So the games that are popular, that are fun to play, which luckily a lot of the Nintendo ones are common, those are going to keep its value. It's the ones that people don't play, that don't give a crap about, like Conan the Barbarian for Nintendo. Those are the ones I think that are going to be harder to sell moving forward, because I think less people are going to care, and less people are going to spend the money at what the card is currently at. And so I think the other reality moving forward is that it'll be really interesting to see if how brick and mortar stores survive. We fast forward 10 years, when I think the craze is going to die down. Is less supply out there going to affect prices as well? So it'll be really interesting to see that. I think that right now brick and mortar retro game stores, for the most part, are on life support, and that I think.
You think so?
I think so. Within 10 years, I think it's going to be a much harder thing to do. We'll see, and part of that is just availability of product, and so I'm just kind of keeping an ear to the ground locally, because I put on a charity game event, so I like vendors to be okay and to do okay. But I think it'll be really interesting to see moving forward in the next 10 years to see how that will affect the market. I predict that,
well, sure.
I predict that brick and mortar stores in the next 10 years will see a significant decline.
Or maybe the ones I get into it later
Yes.
that never got their footing. They're the ones we got, last in, first out sort of thing.
Yeah, I think established stores like Video Game Wizards in Portland, I see stores like that doing all right. The big stores that can diversify and to do other things, but I think the small ones, much harder time moving forward.
Sure. While we were talking, I wanted to check out the price of Contra because that was interesting, and I used price charting. Now, we can have a whole conversation about price charting. I think overall it's good to have something like this available, as long as they track also sales that are done privately, which I've spoken to the guy who runs at JJ Games about that, about being able to incorporate some sales like that. I know it's tough, but that's what they do for sports card publication in the past and comics. But I did look up Contra. Contra, according to price charting, peaked at $47.95 loose, June 2016. We are a year later. It's $27.50. So that's a decline of, what is that, 40% lower, something like that.
You've also
You've
also seen cheap multi-carts being produced recently. I don't know how often, but there's been some really cheap pirated multi-carts available that have like 501 and these cartridges that have a lot of the classics on. And I think the rise in multi-cart collecting and a lot of collectors that just get the classic consoles, but then instead of collecting the games, they'll get a multi-cart and call it good. And I wonder if that's affecting the market as well.
DuckTales. The highest it ever was actually, for some reason, maybe this is when they announced the remastered one, $21 loose in March 2013. It went back down. June of last year, $20.35. Now $13.65. Again, that's about a 40% decrease.
It's a pretty big decrease,
price.
Yeah, definitely.
And this is surprising me just because I guess I don't, being that I'm not collecting for NES anymore, just like the few games I have left to look for. Besides, I look for manuals. I'm down to like 15 or 20. I don't track these prices as much. Whenever I have conversations with Ian, I'm also even thinking, wow, am I ahead of the curve? Am I behind the curve when it comes to these prices? Like where am I at when it comes to this stuff? So now I'm getting almost like a crash course now in terms of pricing now. Maybe they peaked a year ago. I don't know. Even for these popular ones.
I've seen a change in the market in general in the last year. And it's the mood. It's just talking to local game stores. Some local game stores I've talked to are struggling. Some of the bigger ones are doing okay. But again, it goes back to that whole mentality of collecting. At what point is it too expensive to purchase something, or at what point do I just kind of get a multi-cart call good, or get a Raspberry Pi. Or I think there's more and more people that are accepting that is okay to just to play the games and call it good. We have more and more people that grew up with emulators and just playing the ROMs is okay. And, like you said, we are dinosaurs. And so there'll always be a pocket of people that will prefer physical media. And I'm thankful for that. And there's nothing wrong with playing stuff on an emulator box but it will affect prices. And because if less people are buying, the demand goes down, and therefore drives the price down. And so it'll be interesting to see how low things will go, and at what point does it really affect things significantly.
Let's see. Little Samson peaked last summer at $12.50. It went down a little bit. Now it looks like it's about $11.30, so a slight difference. Let me see Dinosaur peak. But that also can be a case of, and I've seen this before, where there are sellers there's certain sellers that have at least a dozen copies of a single game, and that bothers me more than anything probably else in this whole scene.
Oh yeah,
because obviously that affects the market. Yeah. When you see a game like Little Samson as a prime example, triple in value in 4 years, or double in value over a year. Basically, let's see, December of 2014 was at $677, and then you look a year later, it's at $1,200. Like just about. Or $1,000. So there's something going on there besides just supply and demand. It's obviously people outside the quote-unquote scene getting into it. I mean, does that bother you, or is it the same sort of thing where it's to be expected that these guys that maybe came from the toy collecting world see video games being profitable and get into it? I mean, when I went to Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con last year, which is sort of the benchmark of all geek culture, for the first time ever, when I went to Comic-Con last year, I saw probably 2 or 3 dealers of comic books that were graded also have graded video games there. And I was like, that's it. We've peaked. This is it. When you have people that have no interest at all from the comic book world seeing that they're noticing that these video games have value, sealed, that are graded, and trying to try to get into that market, that's when I think we've peaked. That's my personal sort of moment. That happened last year.
Yeah, I think that the big thing is my hat's off to resellers that are selling just an out of print product that that something walked into their store and they're selling and they're making a profit to keep the lights on. That's one thing. There's another thing of being a reseller and trying to manipulate the market by trying to have a corner on all the product so that it raises the value of something. We saw this with the NES Classic Mini, which was a retail product, which I think you're a scumbag if you're trying to profit off something that's really trying to be sold at retail and new. Same thing with a classic game. If someone is trying to manipulate the product, the stock of something, by going out and purchasing all the Flintstones 2 Surprise the Dinosaur Peak carts so that they can make money off of it, I think that's pretty shady, and I do not support it whatsoever.
I had a seller say it to my face. This was, I want to say, what was the last Classic Game Expo I went to? 2012. To my face, he said he had about, I forget, it was either somewhere between 12 and 18 Dinosaur Peaks he had purchased. And you don't think that drives the price up because you're outbidding everyone else trying to get one for their collection? This is the argument I have sometimes with other people, somewhat big collectors or even people in the retro gaming scene, where like, oh no, it's impossible to manipulate the market, or oh no, it is possible. It's not just simple supply and demand. Scalping obviously is a factor, and there is a psychology that goes on with bidding on eBay to be that winner. And there, we saw with this Steam events, there could be some shill bidding going on. Oh, yeah. We don't know. There's all these factors. The one that I'm not sure you ever heard of that we covered on the podcast was Incognito. A guy tested this theory out because I spoke about price manipulation that's possible. So one guy went out and bought all the black and white Game Boy Rampart games, all the ones he could find over, I think it was a 6-month period. So when you look at the price like quadrupled. And I don't think it went back down that much. I'm gonna check it right now, actually, because I'm interested. But that was a prime example.
Yep.
He bought. Yeah. If you look at the jump up on price charting between, it was like 2014, the price jumped from like an $8 game to like 20 to 25. That was one guy that did that.
Yep.
Just one guy that took a game that no one really cared about, Rampart and Game Boy, and he bought the ones he saw, and the price just went up. Then it crashed. Then it looked like it's been jumping around. So it's just amazing to me how people can deny this. And I wonder if they deny it because they're afraid of the value of their collection going down.
Absolutely.
Or people...
I agree.
People... You think that's what it is?
I think so. I think there's a lot of people out there that are scared about the value going down because that's honestly why they got into it. And, you know, I say this time and time again when I'm doing my, you know, presentations at various game shows about, you know, get into something for the right reasons. You know, it's one thing if it's your business, okay? That's straight up simple. It's your livelihood. That's fine. But if you're getting into video games just purely for investment, it's a total gamble, and you need to understand what comes up comes down, and it eventually will come down. I don't believe in the up and up theory forever. It ultimately, parts of the game market are going to have a correction. It is coming. I don't know when it is. I predicted it would already happen. It didn't. But I'll tell you what, this last year I've definitely seen a mood change just in the collector community around here. That it's just, I don't know, people are just kind of even agreeing that, and these are a lot of these people are vendors, that they're agreeing that at least for Nintendo, the market has peaked.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just looked up the few right now, but I'm going to start doing this more and more just to see it. But it looks like, I think Contra, that's a huge one to me because Contra is a very common game. It's a 5-star game, and that one, like I said, that dropped 40%. That was shocking to me. I never knew it got up close to $50 average. That's amazing
crazy
to me that it got that high. A game that they produce millions and millions of, you know, like a game that everyone had. Like if you had an NES, 9 times out of 10 in the 80s and early 90s, you had Contra for it. All my friends had Contra.
It's a great game.
So it's 5 stars according to a certain NES guide.
That's right. I would agree with that.
What do you, in terms of investing? Yeah, I'm similar in terms of. I always say if you want to invest, buy stocks, be an angel investor, invest in a business. You know, something that you have a definite, you can see the future a little bit and sort of guide. Yeah, it's almost like playing roulette when you're buying video games in order to retire on. To me, that's just my opinion on that. I've seen big titles like one of the most famous one being, I think, Cowlitz 6 and 1. Used to be $1,000 sealed game. Then guess what? They find a whole truckload of them in Mexico sealed, and then the value goes down to like $300, you know, on it. What was the other one? I think the Atari 2600 one, Atari Warriors.
That's exactly Motor Rodeo. Yep.
Atari Warriors was one. I was like, wow, this is a very rare game. Guess what? Then they find a few pallets of them, right? And then all of a sudden the price plummets.
Then in Venezuela, that extra stock appeared, and now that game is like, I haven't looked recently, but I think it's in the $20 range. I mean, it's like
for a sealed copy.
Yeah, for a sealed copy.
So it's one of those just strange things, and it gets back to, I guess, the purity of it. But that's interesting about the heart of the business. What do you think about the evaporation of physical media? So do you think there'll be you say they're going to be gone, you know, some are going to disappear in the next few years, which I agree with. 20 years from now, do you think we're even going to have a retro video game store at that point?
No.
Or that be like an antique shop where you'll get some people every now and then going in and looking for let's buy a dusty old Super Mario 3, but will people really be interested in buying PS3 games 20 years from now?
I don't think so. I think that having a pure retro game store will be a novelty. You might find it in the big cities like Los Angeles, Portland, New York. But your standard town, you will not have enough product to survive in 20 years having a pure retro game store. It might be a novelty or part of a store. It might have a little corner. But honestly, I don't see that happening because there's not going to be enough product around for it to survive. I think the other thing too, one thing that differs this from DVDs or records or something else is the format differences make this stuff really hard to keep in selling condition. There's different formats, there's different quirks about different consoles that make it pretty challenging to provide this. And I think unless you really know what you're doing, you're not going to be able to survive. And there's a lot of people that are just getting into it because they see easy money. And you also see these same people not being able to make it because they don't know what they're doing.
So do you think the knowledge is going to be lost for people like us and we die off and no one cares anymore?
I think YouTube, one thing I really appreciate about YouTube is that getting the information out there about a console and having some physical museums. I'm the first one to admit that the more people that are passionate about preserving something, the better. I don't think there should be a corner market on it. Hopefully there are museums everywhere that showcase the physical media aspect, and I'm not seeing that part of it because it's a huge freaking challenge to do it. I want to do this locally, and we're gonna see how close I'm gonna get in the next 10 years. But I think that there will always be dinosaurs out there that appreciate this old stuff. But I've told this on several other podcasts. I see myself like the old train people in 25 years. I'm going to be at some little spot talking and being passionate about video games, and there'll be a percentage of people caring about it, but I don't know how big that will be. I'll probably have my little game hat on and my little,
You know what? That's actually fascinating because, train collecting was huge, wasn't it, at one point?
Yeah.
You're talking kids that grew up in the 30s to 50s. And then I guess that got big and probably peaked in the 80s. I remember even my dad had collected trains in the 80s.
Trains was everywhere.
Had a train board.
And you talk to these people, they're super passionate about it. And they do these little shows. And these shows are like sub 100 people. And they're usually older men. And I see that as physical media collectors, as time goes on, it's going to be very niche. And there's going to be people that care about it. But because it's going to get so hard to maintain and collect, that few are going to do it. Especially very few people are going to be willing to have this on display in a physical area where others can play and touch on it.
Sure. Do you see companies like Limited Run Games providing physical media for games that are digital download helping sustain the livelihood of physical media? Or is that like a stopgap? You think it will have a little effect?
So I have a very... this is an honest opinion about Limited Run Games. So this is just, I haven't shared this a lot with many people. I compare Limited Run Games to comic books, foil comic books of the 90s. And I'm being honest here. I think it's a great concept, but what they've tried to do is make a false collecting market with games that are good and bad. I have nothing against Limited Run Games. But I think it's kind of like it's a false collecting item is what whenever you identify and try to sell a game as a collector's item, it probably isn't. The market's peaked. And that's just my thoughts on it. I just think Limited Run Games is great, but I think as time moves on, and I'm already seeing this at shows up here. I went to a small video game show, and there was a ton of that stuff everywhere, and it wasn't selling. Do
you think it's a case of maybe the collectors helping prop it up in the beginning because they're the ones that want to, still have physical means? Obviously the Vita, putting out games for a dead handheld like the Vita, that can't all be collectors, can it? There's probably some hardcore Vita people out there who actually want a game in physical form.
Yeah, I think there's a market out there for certain people, but the more that Limited Run makes, it doesn't become limited anymore. It becomes kind of more of a burden and a hassle. And I've talked to a lot of collectors, and they've kind of commented this. They said, well, at first they were cool because they were hard to get and limited supply, and now it's just kind of a thing. And now other companies are doing it, like PlayAsia is doing their own kind of limited physical media version. They did it with Medea Castilla, and some other games out there. There's some other companies too that are jumping in on this idea. I think as time moves on, it will become kind of a fad and kind of die away. And you might see companies still do it in the future, but I don't know. It makes me not want to collect it. The more that they do and the harder it is to get it, I didn't grow up with it either. I don't have that like childhood connection that I do that versus like Castlevania or Contra or Robotron. And
what about what if there's something like I'm actually excited personally about something like the Night Trap release just because it's actually the ability to play it in a better format than what we ever had before.
I will probably track that down because I remember that, and I'm a huge Sega CD fan, So that to me, like I would say, limited run games on a small level, I'll probably pick up an occasional game. But does it do really anything for me? Well, first of all, I don't see myself really pursuing collecting PS4 in large volumes. I'm going to pick up stuff that's novelty or interesting. And Night Trap, totally going to pick that up. Because, I grew up with that. That was pretty interesting. I played that at a rental store, and I remember playing that, and my parents were coming over, seeing what I was playing. I remember turning it off. didn't want my parents to see what I was playing. So, stuff like that's pretty interesting. And again, it's nothing against limited run games because they're a business. They're just trying to keep above water, and I think they're providing a service that many people enjoy. It's just I don't think it's a true collectible item. I think it's more of like a 90s foil comic book.
Well, I was still thinking of just at least the value of still producing physical media, because the argument always is that physical media itself is dying for new consoles, and at least you'll have someone out there trying to produce it, at least on a preservation standpoint. Yeah. It'll be easier to get these games in the future and to go back and play them.
It will be nice. It will be nice for that aspect. Yes.
Do you think there's room for reproductions of disc-based games? Say, like someone goes out and does reproduces the actual Sega Saturn, Night Trap, do an official release. Would that be something you think is possible, or would there be a market for that?
Well, I know that there's a company in Europe that's already making some pretty decent quality reproduction discs, and I got a couple. I got Time Cop from them, which was not released, and the quality on the disc is pretty good. I definitely see reproduction disc games happening. Now,
is that official though, or is that
no,
not official?
No, and I think it'll be interesting to see what companies do with their backlog, and I think there'll be. And I'm actually surprised Nintendo hasn't done this. I did this on one of my channels, one of my videos. I kind of said, what's stopping Nintendo from making a limited cartridge run of a particular unreleased game?
Well, it's hard to make those ROM boards from scratch nowadays, in big bundles, right? But they don't have those factories anymore.
But disc-based, I definitely see that companies testing the water, but whether it won't be a big appeal. I think there'll be a collector market maybe in a small factor. I don't know. I think it's pretty niche, and I think that part of the challenge is because the more limited run games makes, the more it doesn't become a limited run anymore.
You mean in terms of the amount?
Yeah.
For that run, they make 20,000 games. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting thought. I've spoken to the guys before about certain things.
Yeah, they're nice people. I mean, I have nothing against them.
What do you think? Just we briefly spoke about the Steam Events auction. When you see something like that, what's your gut reaction? $42,000 for a game that there's a 20+ sealed Steam Events that are known to exist. What does that tell you?
Well, that tells me that someone rich out there wanted to have a very expensive mantelpiece. And really that comes down to it, that someone out there with a lot of money wanted to have the rarest Nintendo game sealed just to brag about having the rarest game sealed. I mean, that's really what something like that. I mean, that's really what someone, maybe a collector, that was the last game they needed. And they got a very large loan and want that last sealed game. But that is ridiculous. I mean, I get it. It doesn't surprise me on value whatsoever, but it's just I think part of it being trying to preserve video games. There's so much information on or attention on the Holy Grail stuff. And there's not a lot of attention on like the kind of the oddball stuff. And so
yes.
It doesn't make me sad per se, but it's just like I get asked all the time, what's my rarest video game in my collection? And it's usually my answer is Stadium Events or some, but I try to pick something else sometimes just because I'm tired of talking about Stadium Events. And so it's really interesting. But going back to that, that's my thoughts. So that's someone very wealthy is wanting that and to show other people that he has it.
Well, is it just sort of they're unaware that there's so many others out there that could possibly, I mean, Tim Atwood has 6 still that he's holding on to, that he could sell those at any moment Yeah, he could give one to someone. He can give away 2 of those to a collector and make them sign something that they won't be selling it for at least 10 years, and that's 2 people out of the market for that. I always argue that the danger in investing in some of these, to me, statements is oddball in and of itself.
Yeah.
Because it's a game that it's not a good game. It was re-released on the console, and we don't know if there's any still left. We don't know if Bandai has a bunch still somewhere in Japan. We don't know if Nintendo. There's no confirmation that they were actually destroyed. There's no confirmation that they were even technically even recalled. We don't know. We're still waiting. I'm trying to work with someone to contact Howard Phillips to really look back in his records to say what was the actual information at the time. What did they tell Bandai once Nintendo bought the rights to the Family Fun Fitness Pad? What did they tell them? Just don't ship it anymore. Don't make it anymore. We don't know. We have absolutely no clue, and that's what's scary about this stuff. Like, what happens if this is another Ikari Warriors for 2600?
You bring up a good point, because that could happen with anything, and that's why I tell people when you're investing, you're gambling. There's no guarantee that things will keep their value, and that's really what my message is. I'm not trying to I don't hate people that game invest, but my big issue is that there isn't a guarantee. My advice is get into the hobby. If you're collecting video games, just know what you're getting into and understand that value can change all the time. And that should, if you're really wrapped up into the value of things and nothing else, don't do it, because you'll eventually get disappointed. and then what happens if, I'm ecstatic actually when a large lot of stuff gets found, because there's collectors out there that can finally afford getting stuff. And I love that. I love seeing that, and I hate it when there are games really a great game and it's hard to find. And that the more people that we can share this hobby with, the better. And it's a tough market right now, because you have a lot of different people for not always the best reasons jumping in.
How do you feel, like the most famous one, which was Tim Atwood? How do you feel when he gets attacked by a certain gaming community for basically they feel threatened that there's this guy they didn't know about that has so many sealed games that can destroy the market if he wants to? How does it make you feel? Does that put everything in perspective for you? Like, okay, these are people that should not be collecting then. They should be, instead of celebrating this man and what he has had in for 20 years virtually unknown to them. Personally, it made me doubt the whole scene in terms of, wow, is there really more people into this for the wrong reasons than the right?
Absolutely. I wait a minute. I have a big tear for them. Wait. Okay, there it is. Yeah, I could care less. Those people that are so upset that their investment is affected by someone who really is it's kind of cool that he did that, actually. And I know that I've been followed some of your podcasts on that about I think it's you need to if you're really getting into this just for investment, then you will be disappointed, because who knows what else is out there. And I think that there's a ton of people that are sitting on product. And I guarantee when the market starts to change, you're going to see a lot of people try to get out. And it could be over time. Who knows when it will happen? It will happen, though. How big of a correction will be? Unknown. People have asked me that all this time. I'm not a speculator. I didn't get into this for money, and I'm definitely not going to keep doing it because of money. People ask me all the time what my collection's worth. I have no freaking idea. Nor do I really care. That's not why I'm doing it.
Do you feel frustration, because it's not hard to peg certain people that are collectors, but when collectors look at people like me and you, and we have very valuable collections, probably 6 figures at least somewhere, and they say we say to them, well, I really don't care about the value. Do you think some people, they said it doesn't click for them? It's like, well, how can you not care about the value when you're sitting on a gold mine?
Absolutely, and I tell them that. And it's like, it doesn't compute. Well, why don't you know how much it's worth? Because honestly, I don't give a crap. I really don't. It's not about that for me. It's because I love this stuff. I love collecting it. I love talking about it. I'll tell you what. This hour of talking, this hour and a half that we've been doing, is the best part of my day. just talking about video games. I guarantee this will be the best part of my day, probably my week, of just talking about video games.
Let's not get nuts, John. I'm not that interesting. Come on.
Well, but I'm serious. But it's because I care about video games, not about the value. I care about the history. I love talking about it. I love talking about it to other people that give a crap about this stuff. And really, that's what it comes down to. And if you're just care about the investment, the value part of it, you're missing the point. You really are.
Speaking of that, what do you think of? What's your first reaction when you hear the term shelf collector?
Well, I've been called that quite a bit, and it's tough. There are shelf collectors out there, and I personally don't have an issue with shelf collectors. Shelf collectors is different than someone that invests in something. Shelf collector might be, okay, I grew up with this game, and I want to have it on my shelf because when I look at that, it reminds me of something positive from the childhood. I don't think you have to play everything you collect. I mean, I have a huge collection. I don't play everything I own. Part of it is that, essentially we'll have unlimited supply of YouTube content forever, as long as I want to do this. And so the term shelf collector, I think it's, for people that just game and don't collect, that don't have a filter, that's what they want to call people that collect physical media. And it's just, it's kind of a derogatory term. And I think that I don't have an issue with it. If someone wanted to call me a shelf collector, so be it.
I think it's a little unfair. Hell, even Ian's calling me that. I mean, hell, I obviously I've played all my games. I did a book. I do a charity event. I mean,
God bless you.
I grew up with it. This is why I think it's unfair, because it doesn't look at the entire picture.
Correct.
And I'll bring you as an example and me. And I'm not calling you a shelf collector. I'm saying you can be called one. I've been called one. The quote-unquote shelf collector is also the person that is most likely then to go out and find those products or investigate and find quote-unquote those oddball items, to go out and investigate and find those things that someone who only cares about playing the popular games on an emulator or whatever else won't ever care about looking into. So I think the knowledge base for these rare items and for the weird stuff it trickles down in terms of interest. So you start with the person that wants to go after all the stuff that's known. Then it's like, okay, what's the weird crap out there now? What's the stuff that was, either unreleased or was released and recalled? What's the stuff that's regional? What's the stuff that 99.9% of even collectors won't think about? But that has to start with someone that wants to put a bunch of stuff on shelves. I think that's where it starts. Yep. I would not have gotten to the point where I am now, finding stuff that to me is interesting, because you know what? It's not interesting for me to go out and now get every box for NES games. Instead, I'm going to find that weird accessory no one knows about. I'm going to find that weird peripheral that there's not even a video of on YouTube showing it off. That's, I think, more quote-unquote a person like me or a shelf collector versus a random person that just wants to play Contra and Rescue Rangers. That's just my opinion on it. So that's why I think the term is unfair.
Yeah, I don't like hearing it. I mean, it's definitely, and I would say I'm much more than a shelf collector. My long-term goal is to have a museum, and I'm pretty ambitious about that, and have talked to some local people and at least started a conversation and a game plan of moving forward.
That's fantastic. And I've had a thought in my head about, okay, if I get in my 40s, what the hell am I going to do with these games? At that point, like, what am I going to do with this? What am I doing with 2 games worth combined, I don't know, $60,000 in a bank vault? What does that do for me personally? Versus at least putting them on display, letting other people look at them, learn about the history, and enjoy them.
Absolutely. You're in a good spot too.
Yeah, I am. San Diego, I think, it's prime for it. Southern California, there's not a lot of that out here. I mean, there's only, SoCal Retro Gaming Expo just started up a couple of years ago, and there's a big population here. But I think that's where I'm seeing it. People like Steve Lynn, Chris Kohler. Obviously, you have Joe Santulli with the Video Game History Museum in Texas, who runs Digital Press. I think you're starting to see that switch from collector to preservationist / archivist, people like Frank Cifaldi, to, all right, let's open up a museum. Let's share the knowledge.
Absolutely, and have multiple ones.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. I think that we can benefit from multiple people having these places where games can be preserved, and I think they need to be across the United States. And I definitely don't want to have, I'm not going to have the cornerstone of what I do. I just want to have it locally so I can have my eye on my collection, and that it's close, and that. But I have some ideas about what I want to do, but I definitely support multiple museums being opened up. I don't believe that there needs to be one. I think that's a disservice to the preservation. And that the more of these that we can have around the United States, the better we can preserve a larger majority of things. Mm-hmm. And I think there definitely needs to be them. And hopefully in the future, I think we will see them. As soon as the longer time goes, it is. I mean, I'm already telling my wife, I go to a game show and I walk back with maybe only a handful of things that I'm looking for. And my wife says, because you're looking for things that belong in a museum and they're just not there anymore.
Oh, sure. But yeah. So we have what? We have the Museum of Play in New York. We have the Video Game History Museum in Texas. Are there any others that are really out there?
Yeah, there's a computer one that doesn't really do video games, which is understandably so. It's the one with the co-founder of Microsoft. The Living Computer Museum in Seattle. It's a cool museum. It's in a terrible part of town, and it's cool. It's really cool, but ironically, there isn't even one in Seattle, which blows my mind. It really, if you really think about it, part of it is I think companies haven't thought like that. They've thought and focused so much on staying alive and selling a product. They haven't really fully understand how important their history is.
Sure.
And I think Nintendo, honestly, I think Nintendo's done a brilliant job with understanding that, at least on the surface. I think there's many more things to come that are going to impress people. I heard about what Sega had done. I don't know if you've heard this story, but Sega had a collection of all their games that they did. And they were in this little room, and they were stacked upon each other, and they were just like the boxes were getting crushed.
Oh no!
And it was like it was terrible, I guess. But I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that worked at certain companies that their own company didn't know what they made, and
oh my God.
or history. I know it kills me. I mean, at one point there was Sega had a president that didn't even know that Streets of Rage was a franchise. So I mean that's a whole other story. But I mean it's that type of thinking out there that really hurts the preservation. We need more companies to just archive everything because it matters. It matters, and I think it's important to have that history of something preserved.
Well, Nintendo has the little museum in the world of Nintendo, right? So they at least have something like that to show off. Yeah. I think they have the AVS prototype, I believe. The original NES they have, I think, there, I believe, for example. Someone might correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about that. Yeah, I think that's where we're going to head. I'm not sure that it's going to spawn a new generation going, if you even have a museum in every state in the U.S., which I don't think that'll ever happen.
Yeah,
for retro games.
I think it'll be niche, and I think it'll be novelty, and it'll have to be a nonprofit and some way of funding to support it, and just time will tell. And again, it's I think it'll be important to have these things. And part of the reason why I think it's important to have them in multiple locations is someone's going to go to the museum. They're going to remember that one of their family members worked at, I don't know, a place, and they're going to dig up some old archive stuff, and then they're going to donate it to this museum. And the more places that we can have that are like that, the more we're going to actually save some of the stuff that's rotting somewhere.
That's a fantastic point. I mean, it's not like we've even found every prototype of games that are unreleased. I mean, there's still ones out there that are still being found every year, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's
it's
crazy.
absolutely amazing. Do you remember that we've done one or two panels together in the past?
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about that a little bit. I remember, what was it? Was it 2000? Let's see, 2011 was my first Portland one. They still had it at the garage at the DoubleTree, right? Basically underneath the garage.
Yeah.
What was it? It was about, I guess, balancing. How do you balance being a video game collector with real life? Was that sort of what it was?
Yeah. It was a great panel. It was cool having that with you. And again, I knew you're a big NES collector, and it's been great to to keep our friendship over time, and it's always a pleasure seeing you. And yeah, it was. I could tell early on that you were passionate about collecting Nintendo. You knew your stuff. Had a fantastic video series, and I just knew that you were the real deal. And yeah, it was great doing that, and just how time has kind of came along. I left being on board on the organizational board of PRGE that year, and I had a lot going on in my life. I had 2 jobs and just wanted to do my local charity thing, and it's neat to kind of for me to come full circle where I'm kind of gotten back into collecting and talking about it, and kind of established my own identity as separate from PRGE, which I'm still friends with all of them, and they've definitely supported my local gaming event. So it's cool. It's cool to see full circle, to see you successful is always a pleasure. And again, you keep doing what you're doing. That's really.
Geez, John.
I mean, seriously, man, we need that voice of reason out there, and to say the things that are hard to say. And the thing is, when you're honest and brutally honest with something, not everybody wants to hear it, but it's good to get it out there.
Well, that's what I wasn't trying to close the interview, by the way, but I was going to bring up something in a second about balancing life and collecting, but we can get into that. We can at least have another conversation. But speaking of the harshness, Ian and I took some flack about us getting down on repro labels when 8-Bit Guy, who's been, I think, a guest at Portland Retro Gaming Expo, when he was talking about making repro labels, and we wanted to educate, I guess, the general audience about the dangers of that. And man,
I love talking about this.
We got hammered, and it's interesting that we get hammered by the people that aren't into video game collecting. Like, I think there's a gap there between, I think, the dangers of it. I don't know where you actually stand on this. I don't know if you think it's okay.
We can totally talk about this. I love talking about this. In fact,
all right. I
was one of the first shows to have a reproduction policy. And so a lot of people don't know this because this happened a long time ago. I won't say exactly who I was talking to, but I walked up and a vendor had a stadium event at a PRGE show.
I was there. I think that was the 2011 show.
And it was a major problem. And so that conversation has evolved because more and more people are buying a reproduction. And so Portland Retro Gaming Expo, and I'm going to let them announce their policy, but they will have a reproduction policy in place this next year. This is a policy that part of the person with discussion was Chris Trimu, who sells reproductions, by the way, and having strict policies on what can be reproduced and how the label should look on the cart and where that actually is located on a vendor's table and how it should be labeled and all that stuff. In fact, there was a particular vendor that had a conniption fit over this new policy because they didn't want to follow it. And wow. I have to say to that person, too bad, because the standard person is not going to have the knowledge or understand what they're buying.
So you're like me, you hate where people say, well, it's the buyer's responsibility, not basically letting the seller off the hook for their unethical behavior.
Absolutely.
So let's just clarify. When you're saying reproductions, you're not talking homebrews. You're talking someone that gets a little Samson with the same label.
Correct.
Obviously, it may not be the same color, and then plops it down and is selling it for $80 or $100 or more.
Yeah, so the policy that we have is that we don't allow, and this is Cowlitz Gamers, this is not PRG. Cowlitz Gamers does not allow any North American game to be reproduced. Period. That if you don't want a stadium events, you cannot sell it at our show if it's a reproduction.
And so that you don't care about it saying a repro on the label, that's still not good. You don't care if it's a different label, you just don't want it.
Don't want it. And other shows, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of PRGE. I'm going to let them announce their reproduction policy. But some shows have accepted the fact that if it is a reproduction, it needs to have a reproduction on the label. I don't have that at my show because a label can be torn off.
Sure. I love seeing the ones on eBay where, the reproduction is the bottom left, and all of a sudden, there's damage to that Dinosaur Peak label. Guess where? Bottom left of the label. Yeah, it's not good. So that's what I try to always communicate, but I always get pushback, and it's obviously pushback from people that aren't video game collectors or people that don't run video game shops. Where this is counterfeiting. Let's not sugarcoat this. This is not innocent. This is you know, if this let's put it this way, if this was another industry, you know, they'd go after these people, being that they're old video games, that the publishers don't care about it. Like, I mean, we don't even know who's actively, I mean, who owns the rights to Little Samson that's going to care about it. You know what I mean? Like, they don't care. They're not making money off it, so they're not going to do that. But if this was another industry making like Gucci bags or something, that would be they'd be stopped lickety split. You know,
yeah, it's tough, and it's a bad part of the market right now. And if there's any advice I can give out there to buying high end games, bring a bit set.
Yep.
And if a vendor doesn't allow you to look inside the cart, then guess what? Don't do it.
Yeah,
because what are they hiding? You know? Exactly.
But I think it's hysterical that there's this movement to legitimize repros by selling them for hundreds of dollars. Like, so, so Dinosaur Peak, it's a $1,100 cartridge. All right, so the repro's $400 or $300, and it's like, what? No, that costs you $15 on AliExpress.com to get that. I mean, that's ridiculous. So real quick. Your thoughts? We probably have the same thoughts on the good old video game authority grading sealed games.
Oh, jeez. Oh man. Where do we start? I'll just say right now, I think it's a bunch of crap. And,
oh wow! I'm not going to sugarcoat that. All right.
No, it's a bunch of crap. Bunch of crap. Never support. I don't have a single graded item in my collection, and I'm proud of it. And a single one. And the reason why is that this is a business. This is a business like anything else. They're not game experts. They I do believe started with other things and jumped into games because there wasn't anybody doing it. Doesn't make them experts. In fact, I could set up a sealed grading service and probably have more knowledge than them. Just call it John Hancock's, thumbs up, thumbs down seal service, and send it to me, and I'll put it in a shiny box and I'll say it's good, and it's just so silly and stupid. People don't buy this junk. Don't get your stuff graded. It totally. I mean, you're putting your game in a coffin. If you ever want to get it out of one of these, good luck. You have to destroy the case to get it out. It's the stupidest thing. I really am against it.
What is your thoughts on people saying, well, those games were meant to be played anyway because they're still sealed? What is your thoughts on that argument?
Well, I mean, if someone wants to preserve something in the original seal, that's great. But the reason why they're getting it graded is so that they can resell it.
Yeah, they think it's going to inflate the value artificially.
It's musical chairs. It's the worst type of musical chairs because you want to grade it. You then want to resell it, and you don't want to be the last person holding an expensive item that can't be sold.
Sure. Yeah, they do action figures. They do dolls. I think they're also part extension of the people that do comics, I believe. They're going to be at Comic-Con accepting submissions, but I think it's going to be funny to see if someone's dropping off sealed games there.
Yeah, and it comes down to investment. It's everything that I hate about it, and it's not about preservation. They kind of hide behind that. For people that are into it, they hide behind saying it's preservation. It's not about preservation. It's about reselling.
What if I told you probably wouldn't be shocked that basically one of the higher-ups in the video game collecting community that has knowledge of this got a resealed game graded as authentic? Would that surprise you?
Not at all. And I know that that's happened multiple times, and I know that they've made a lot of mistakes. And it's just a business, and it defeats the whole purpose of doing it. And they've made money. The people that have done it have made a lot of money, and they don't want to hear anything else because that'll affect their bottom dollar.
Hey, I love the actual acrylic cases. I got one built for the NWC cards. I mean, that's fine.
Of course.
If you want to do that, that's fine. You want a protected cover, but yeah, I think
absolutely. I mean, that's different. Mm-hmm.
I am happy though that it never took off. That it's still very, very, very niche. Like when I went to Too Many Games, I saw only really one seller featuring graded games, and guess what? They also had graded comic books, surprisingly.
Yep.
But no one was buying. But I don't think anyone's buying them though. I just don't. I think it's a very small group of people that are interested in finding the ones that are out there, getting an 85 or God forbid a 90 grade or 95, whatever uncirculated, and then I think it's a very small group.
It is a small group, and I've never been a cellophane collector, and there's nothing wrong with being a cellophane collector. Just know that I'm not going to really support it, and it's just goes down the rabbit hole of like it's everything that I hated about collecting action figures transferred over to video games.
Sure.
I got upset about collecting an action figure because it had a dent on one corner. and that defeats kind of the whole purpose of getting into the hobby of collecting video games. That's why I got out of collecting comics and action figures, because I wanted to play what I owned. And I respect if I have a couple sealed games in my collection that are crazy expensive, and of course I keep them sealed. Do I care about them being graded? No. Do I care about what they're worth? No. I know that they're rare and I want to preserve that, but it's not about the money or investment or reselling, and that's really the grading aspect of that. And I know several of the people that were into it. It really was down to reselling. It wasn't about preserving anything.
I think that's the difference you just touched on. Because people will call me and you hypocrites. They'll ask, "Oh, well, do you own any sealed games?" I'll say, "Yes, I do, but guess what? I'm not selling them." And that's not the reason I bought them in the first place, and that's the main difference. And yes, there will be people out there with a bunch of graded games that are keeping them. That's not why it's a business, though. That it's not a business for those very few people that want to collect all those graded games. It's a business for people to resell them. Part of the mission statement was this increases the value of VGA, was this will increase the value of your games by having it graded. That was a mission statement of them. They did an interview stating that as such. And their headquarters, I think it's in Georgia. So that's, to me, the main difference. Not saying you can't collect sealed games, but once you get into the graded, I think that you're on a different level where your intentions are pretty clear about what you're doing. And especially when a lot of these guys, again, that are doing this, buying and selling these games, come from the toy world. So they see the opportunity and they just come on in. They couldn't tell you, well, a lot of people that get into selling games can't tell you about the games themselves, but they definitely couldn't tell you anything about the games. They couldn't tell you which one's a good game. They couldn't tell you which one is a classic. They just care about, okay, what's the grade, what's the value, and that's
absolutely
it. Starts and ends there. John, this has been fantastic. Why don't you tell everyone about the Cowlitz for Gamers for Kids event?
Well, we've done a show for this will be our 9th year that we haven't officially announced it, but we're going to be doing it March 31st. March 31st at the Cowlitz Expo Center, woohoo, in Longview, Washington. Last year we raised, in a single video game day event, $14,000 for ARC of Cowlitz County, and that's part of LifeWorks, which is kind of a nationwide nonprofit, but they have a local chapter, and really they support kids with disabilities, Down syndrome, autism, Asperger's, and they do a lot of great services. And we've all proceeds from admission. We do silent auction. We even raffled off a Nintendo Switch. And it's just a local game event. It'll be March 31st of 2018 will be our next one-day event. And it is sponsored by Portland Retro Gaming Expo. They pay for the venue so that more proceeds can go to LifeWorks. And I'm going to be at PRGE with a little booth. If you come to PRGE this next year, I can talk to you more about it. We're going to have some information there about it. And that's kind of my big charity event that I do per year. And then you can find me on the Immortal John Hancock. I have my own YouTube channel. Just look it up, and you'll see my happy face greeting you, talking about some oddball stuff.
And by the way, the website is cowlitzgamers.com. So it's LITZ gamers.com for that information. And John Hancock, you're on Twitter as well?
Yeah, on Twitter as well. And again, it's pretty easy to find us SWLOVINIST. Because I created it before thinking anybody would care.
All right, I'll make sure I put it in the description so people can find you. John, this is fantastic. We got to have more of these talks.
Absolutely, I'd be up for it.
I always look at it as you are the less abrasive version of myself in terms of the collecting world.
All depends on when you talk to me. Before coffee, I can get pretty crabby.
We have a lot of similar thoughts about the collecting scene, but I think people people like to target me because I sometimes I have a little bit less subtle delivery about my thoughts than you do on some of this stuff about grading games and people that get into it for the wrong reasons, for etc. But no, great talking to you, and I'll definitely see you at Portland. This is my 7th one or 8th one.
It's always good seeing you there.
John, thanks for being on board this Not So Common podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks again to John for speaking to me on this Not So Common podcast. Check him out on YouTube and on Twitter at SWLOVINIST. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, iTunes, Google Play, Podbean, Stitcher, or whatever you use to listen to them. You can rate the podcast and leave a comment to help give it a boost, and feel free to spread the word via social media to let others know how much you enjoy it. Finally, if you want to help directly support me and the Not So Common podcast, you can check out patreon.com/PatContry. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.